The night sky over Korvax 9 had no stars. That alone should have been impossible, yet there it hung, a thick, roiling blackness that pressed against the hull of the Valkyrie as if the void itself had weight. We had received no official warning, no distress signal, only the disappearance of the 34th Regiment. Entire battalions, their records, their bodies vanished overnight. My orders were clear: investigate, contain, and report. But the first thing I noticed upon landing was that the air itself tasted wrong, metallic and thick, with the faint tang of ozone and something else I could not name, something alive. The storm that lashed the Hive Plateau ripped at our cloaks, whipping sand and ash into eyes and lungs. Lightning forked across the sky, revealing spires of twisted metal and fractured concrete that should have been familiar as part of the planetary fortifications, but now appeared warped, their geometry subtly wrong. One of the cadets, Corporal Silex, pointed to a shadow moving against the light. A shadow that should not have existed. My Vox confirmed nothing. The squad moved as one, disciplined, but every instinct screamed that we were already being observed. The first anomaly presented itself before we even entered the lower corridors. A hallway wall, cracked and scorched, shimmered like heat over a desert plain, yet the air was frigid. My hand brushed the stone, and the surface pulsated faintly beneath my fingers, as if the hive itself were breathing. I noted it clinically, recording in my mind for later report. Gravity readings slightly off, temperature gradients fluctuating beyond environmental norms. Yet even as I observed, I felt a prickling at the back of my skull, a resonance I could not account for. The warp presence here was subtle, pervasive. We pressed on, boots clanging against metal floors that were slick with condensation, or blood. I could not tell which at first. The smell was faint, almost subliminal, but enough to make one's stomach curdle. Iron tang mixed with ozone and decay. My squad remained silent, all trained to maintain composure, but I caught the occasional tremor of a hand gripping a laser gun too tightly. Comms were jittery. Fragments of old Vox logs echoed between static bursts. A faint litany recited in the low Gothic of the Inquisition, but distorted, like an echo bouncing off the wrong planes. One voice, hauntingly familiar, repeated coordinates and names that I did not recognize. We found the first body, or rather the absence of one. Private Reynolds had stepped ahead and vanished. One moment he was checking a doorframe, the next nothing. Only a scorched boot remained, fused to the floor as if his flesh had been pulled into the concrete itself. The squad froze, laser guns aimed, but the corridors were empty. I ran a scan, nothing. No heat signatures, no movement. Just the lingering warp resonance that now seemed to thrum in time with my own heartbeat. The walls themselves seemed alive. Marks of grafted flesh, still faintly twitching, lined the hallway, like a grotesque fresco in some blasphemous chapel. I could not look away. Each patch of sinew and scar tissue followed a pattern, geometric and alien, impossible for organic matter to arrange naturally. I forced my gaze from the walls to the floor, noting how the puddles of liquid, blood, bile, or hydraulic fluid I could not determine, shifted in ways that contradicted gravity. My squad was whispering in clipped, tactical jargon, but their voices were drowned by a hum that emanated from the very stones, vibrating at a frequency that made teeth ache and eyelids twitch. Telemetry confirmed a spike in residual warp energy across the hive. Whoever or whatever was responsible was not just leaving bodies. They were manipulating the environment itself, bending matter and time to some unknowable purpose. A partial log recovered from the nearby command node hinted at ritualistic sequences referring to the feast in fragments of code and scribbled annotations. I recorded everything, knowing it would make little sense to those who could not see what I was seeing. We moved deeper, the corridors twisting in ways that defied schematic diagrams. Every turn led us not forward but somewhere subtly wrong. Floors slanted imperceptibly. Walls leaned inward as if the hive were enclosing upon itself. My senses began to rebel. Sounds arrived before their sources. Shadows moved independent of light. I noted each anomaly with clinical precision, but it was impossible to maintain detachment. Fear is contagious, and the squad was tense, fingers twitching on triggers, eyes scanning every corner, every fissure. A comms burst cracked through the static, a voice I did not recognize, chanting in low Gothic interspersed with mechanical clicks. The Vox hissed with feedback, but beneath it I could feel the words vibrating in my chest. "The feast approaches," it said, or at least I thought it did. The message cut out, leaving only silence that roared louder than the storm outside. I checked the squad. Each man had stiffened, as though hearing the same voice simultaneously. None spoke. None moved. Then the first micro-cliffhanger manifested. Silex, who had been scanning the walls, staggered backward, eyes wide and unseeing. His mouth opened, but no sound came. When he fell, he left behind a faint blackened residue on the floor, as if his body had been partially consumed by something unseen. The hum intensified, and my mind, trained against superstition, whispered that we had crossed some line. The macro cliffhanger confirmed it. The telemetry indicated that the warp energy spikes were not static. They were converging, coalescing, forming a pattern that suggested not random corruption but intentional design. We were not here merely to investigate. We were intruders in a process already underway. The soul butchers had begun, and the feast had chosen its guests. As we advanced toward the lower hives, the walls pulsed and whispered, and I could not help but feel the hive itself was alive, guiding us toward an altar we had yet to see. And I knew with a certainty I could neither justify nor deny that the next step would reveal horrors that would challenge everything I had been trained to believe. The lower hives smelled of decay and machine oil, mixed in a way that turned the stomach. Every step we took echoed unnaturally, as though the tunnels themselves were amplifying our presence to some unseen observer. The storm above had faded, leaving only a suffocating, static-laden darkness that clung to the walls and our armor. I could feel the warp's resonance more keenly here. It pulsed in time with the grafted sinews that lined the corridor, small fibers twitching in anticipation of our passing. Corporal Silex was gone. I did not have time to mourn. The squad was tense, eyes scanning every alcove. Even seasoned troopers whispered prayers under their breath, hands brushing the litanies tattooed into their armor. The first anomaly hit when we turned a corner. The floor beneath Private Calum shifted like liquid, rippling under his weight, yet the surface appeared solid. He stumbled, catching himself on the wall, and the skin of the grafted sinews quivered as if acknowledging his touch. The room was silent except for the hum, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to carry thoughts, whispers, and warnings all at once. We moved in formation, careful to avoid touching the walls more than necessary. Each corridor branched in impossible angles. Schematics I had memorized meant nothing. At one junction, the walls themselves appeared to bend toward us, creating the illusion of a narrowing space. I reached out to mark the anomaly with my scanner, but the device flickered, caught in a feedback loop that mapped the corridor as infinitely extending. I noted it clinically. The warp presence was actively altering sensor readings, masking reality. The squad discovered the first grafted body in full this time. A human torso fused into the wall, sinews stretching into mechanical conduits, eyes wide and unblinking. It was alive, partially, twitching at our approach, and the sound it made was a wet, sucking noise like blood being siphoned from an unseen reservoir. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to record. The graft followed a precise geometric pattern, fractal and recursive, not random. The body's position was ritualistic, a calculated placement meant to elicit fear, or perhaps to feed the warp resonance that now hummed through the walls. Telemetry readings spiked again. A faint, pulsing signal emanated from deep within the hive, rhythmic, almost musical, yet dissonant to the ears. I recognized it immediately as a partial echo of the feast ritual described in the scribbled logs we had recovered earlier. Every pulse sent a shiver through my chest, and I realized the warp signature was interacting with our own bioelectric fields. My squad noticed the effect in different ways. Calum rubbed at his forearms as veins seemed to ripple beneath his skin. Another muttered of hearing voices in his own head, speaking of doom and inevitability. As we progressed, the environmental anomalies intensified. Gravity fluctuated slightly, just enough to make footing uncertain. Shadows stretched against walls where no light source existed, and faint whispers followed us through the corridors, echoing names and numbers that meant nothing yet carried threat. The hive was alive, conscious, feeding on fear as surely as the grafted bodies were feeding the ritual. My mind, trained in military and mechanicus procedure, cataloged every irregularity, every pulse, every scent, as though a clinical approach could stave off the rising horror. A second micro-cliffhanger arrived when Private Jaren, scanning a lateral tunnel, stepped back sharply and pointed. A hand, human but distorted, with extra joints and blackened fingernails, emerged from a grafted wall and tried to reach him. It recoiled before he could fire, retracting as though the wall itself rejected him. Jaren paled, whispering that the hive was watching, learning. I ordered the squad to maintain formation, but every instinct screamed that we were already part of whatever pattern was being constructed. Our communications began to pick up fragments again, a distorted voice, half machine, half human, reciting coordinates, liturgical phrases and warnings, one line repeated in a loop. The feast consumes, the feast remembers. The feast is incomplete. I recorded it for later analysis, though the voice seemed to echo directly into my skull rather than through the vox. Micro cliffhanger. The voice was accompanied by a sudden fluctuation in temperature. The corridor dropped to near freezing, then immediately surged, leaving frostbite on the exposed skin of the cadets. Then we reached the chamber. The walls pulsed visibly with grafted tissue, sinews contracting in unison as if breathing. In the center lay a tableau of ritual instruments, bone saws etched with incomprehensible litanies, mechanical clamps fused to organic tendons, and a central altar crafted from living flesh and brass. I felt the macro cliffhanger before I even entered. The warp signature converged here, rhythmic and intense like a heartbeat. Whatever the soul butchers were preparing, it was deliberate, systematic, and horrifyingly precise. I ordered my squad to secure the perimeter, but the corridor behind us had shifted. What should have been a clear exit now appeared as a wall of grafted tissue, pulsating, sealing us in. The hive was no longer a passive environment. It had become an active predator. Micro cliffhanger. The hum intensified and a single pulse resonated through the floor, sending Jaren flying backward, slamming into the altar with a wet crunch. His cries were cut short, replaced by a low, continuous moan that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. A partial reading of the instruments revealed something impossible. The bone saws were aligned to a sequence that mirrored the heartbeat of the hive. The mechanical clamps resonated with warp energy, and the central altar appeared to react to our very presence, shifting subtly to face us. I realized the soul butchers were not merely performing a ritual, they were shaping reality itself to accommodate it. The feast had begun in earnest, and we were intruders at the table. I recorded every anomaly, every movement, every sound, knowing it was the only way to retain sanity and provide a record for command. Telemetry confirmed the macro cliffhanger. The warp spike indicated not just a ritual feeding, but a directional energy vector pointing outward. Whatever they were constructing, the soul butchers intended to extend the feast beyond Corvax 9. We were already too late to prevent it, and the hive had marked us as witnesses and participants. The corridors beneath Corvax 9 had become a labyrinth of impossible angles. Every step felt heavier, as though gravity itself were plotting against us. The walls no longer simply contained the hive. They seemed to direct our movement, guiding us toward something unseen, something hungry. The hum that had accompanied us since landing now pulsed in erratic rhythms, like a heartbeat skipping across an invisible threshold. My scanners were useless. Each readout contradicted the last, and the grafted walls twitched at the periphery of perception, reminding me that reality here was negotiable. We advanced cautiously. Private Calum was the first to notice it, shadows that moved independently of any light source. They were subtle at first, flickering across the edges of our vision, but then they began to coalesce, forming shapes vaguely humanoid yet impossible. Extra joints, eyes that rotated against the skull, limbs bending contrary to natural anatomy. The squad reacted instantly, raising laser guns, but nothing tangible existed to fire upon. Micro cliffhanger. One shadow lunged at the wall beside me, passing through the steel as if it were water, leaving behind a thin black residue that sizzled against the metal. The environmental anomalies escalated rapidly. The temperature dropped in sudden bursts, frosting the visors and freezing our breath in jagged clouds. Then, without warning, the walls exuded warmth, almost as if alive, pulsing in time with the grafted flesh stitched into the corridors. I noted each variation clinically. The warp energy readings were spiking, but in a patterned sequence, almost musical, like the hive itself was composing a litany through temperature and tactile feedback. My squad flinched with every change. Their nerves were taut, finely tuned instruments in the hive's orchestra of horror. Comms picked up fragmented logs. The voice was distorted, now clearly both human and mechanical, repeating the same liturgical coordinates with minor variations. The feast, the flesh, the conduit, each iteration twisted further, altering pitch and resonance, embedding itself into our consciousness. Micro cliffhanger. The voice synchronized with a sudden quake in the floor. Calum nearly fell as the tiles beneath him buckled and stretched like living rubber. The corridors were no longer static. They flexed, reshaped, and reoriented in real time. We encountered the next grafted victims in a chamber that had once housed mechanized servitors. The bodies were fused to machinery now, sinews curling into gears and pistons, muscles twitching as though the machine's motion animated the flesh. Eyes stared from sockets that had never existed on the machines, observing us. The sound they emitted was a low, wet resonance, a mixture of moaning and hydraulic hiss. Micro cliffhanger. A severed servitor arm raised itself and reached for Private Jaren, who yelped before it retracted with a wet tearing sound, leaving a smear on the floor. My mind cataloged everything, desperately clinging to logic, but it was failing. Time here had become subjective. Seconds stretched and compressed unpredictably. Conversations repeated mid-sentence. Echoes of our own voices distorted by the warp resonance. Environmental cues contradicted each other. Heat from one wall clashed with cold from the other. Shadows conflicted with light sources. I forced myself to note, the hive was not just alive, it was aware, actively manipulating perception and physical law to confuse and terrorize intruders. The macro cliffhanger manifested in the center of the chamber. A glyph, etched in blackened flesh and brass, began to pulse in rhythm with the hive's heartbeat. The shape was geometric, fractal, and impossible to reconcile with Euclidean space. I recognized the pattern partially from the corrupted logs. It was a conduit, designed to channel warp energy outward. The soul butchers were not merely performing a ritual, they were constructing a warp lattice using the grafted bodies as nodes, and our presence had been anticipated. As we attempted to navigate the chamber, the walls began to shift. What had been a passage leading deeper into the hive now appeared as a solid, pulsating mass of grafted flesh. We were effectively trapped, guided toward the center of the ritual. Micro cliffhanger. Calum screamed as the floor beneath him opened slightly, revealing a pit lined with organic tendons, contracting and pulling at the air like the mouth of a living creature. I pulled him back, but the sensation lingered on my own skin, as if the hive had tasted our fear. The grafted bodies began to react to us. Eyes followed our movement. Limbs twitched as though preparing to pounce, and whispers seeped from the walls themselves. The sounds were incomprehensible at first, fragments of prayers, screams, and mechanical clicks, but gradually a pattern emerged. The feast is incomplete, the hive seemed to intone. Feed, consume, perfect. Macro cliffhanger. I realized that the ritual required active participation, not mere observation. The soul butchers were not passive. They were drawing us into the process, making us instruments of their construction. I ordered the squad to hold formation, but instinct betrayed caution. Jaren reached toward one of the glyphs, entranced, and I caught his wrist just in time to prevent him from touching the pulsating altar. The hive reacted immediately. The walls contracted, compressing the corridor and creating a vacuum that sucked at our armor and lungs. Micro cliffhanger. The hum shifted into a low scream that penetrated my skull directly, leaving me dizzy and disoriented. The squad rallied, but the sense of being observed, of being manipulated, intensified tenfold. We pressed on toward a descending ramp, a passage that promised further progress yet carried the unmistakable signature of warp manipulation. Telemetry confirmed the macro cliffhanger. The warp lattice in this area was extending, linking grafted nodes to an unseen focal point below. Whatever the soul butchers were feeding, it was growing, evolving, and calculating. My own pulse accelerated in response, and I felt the edges of my perception bending. I could sense the hive measuring us, predicting our movements, learning from each hesitation. As the squad descended, shadows merged with the architecture, forming shapes that were simultaneously doors, limbs, and walls. The whispers followed, repeating our names and the name of the feast, the word conduit, reverberating in our minds. I realized with clinical horror that we were approaching the epicenter of the ritual, a chamber where the environmental and warp anomalies would collide fully. Every step carried the promise of physical harm, psychic invasion, or worse, becoming part of the feast itself. We reached the bottom of the ramp, the final micro cliffhanger of the chapter, a doorway that pulsed like a living heart. Behind it, the ambient temperature dropped sharply, and the grafted walls stretched toward us, tendrils quivering in anticipation. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed that this doorway led directly into the ritual's core, the central nexus where the soul butchers would feed, and where reality itself would begin to unravel. I swallowed the rising nausea, aware that passing through would change everything, and there was no turning back. The doorway pulsed like a heartbeat, thick and warm, yet the air beyond it reeked of cold decay. We crossed the threshold cautiously, boots crunching on a floor that felt elastic as if the very ground were alive. The room beyond defied all expectations. Walls stretched impossibly high, spiraling inward in fractal geometry, and every surface was covered with grafted flesh woven into brass conduits. It was both cathedral and slaughterhouse, the architectural manifestation of the soul butcher's liturgy. The hum intensified, vibrating through our bones and filling every corner of the mind with an oppressive sense of inevitability. The grafted bodies were more numerous here, arranged in ritualistic tableau. Limbs fused with mechanical instruments, torsos melded into walls, heads twisted to observe our approach. Each formation pulsed in rhythm with the hive's heartbeat, a synchronized display of grotesque devotion. The smell was overwhelming. Iron and ozone, sweat and decay, the unmistakable tang of warp energy bleeding into real space. I could feel the resonance through my own chest. It was impossible to remain detached. Micro cliffhanger. A hand detached from one of the walls and flexed, moving toward Jaren before recoiling into the flesh seamlessly as if testing us. Gauging our fear, we moved as a unit, lasguns raised, though we all knew they would accomplish little against this fusion of flesh, machine, and warp. The floor beneath us undulated subtly, lifting and dropping as if counting our steps. Calum whispered prayers, but they were swallowed instantly by the low, continuous chant emanating from the walls themselves. The chant was unintelligible, composed of fractured low Gothic and the clicking of servo motors fused with vocal cords. Every syllable resonated with the grafted bodies, reinforcing the ritual and drawing warp energy from the environment. In the center of the room lay the altar, a massive structure of sinew, brass, and bone, adorned with instruments that defied conventional understanding. Bone saws were inscribed with runes that shimmered faintly, and mechanical clamps twitched in anticipation. The altar pulsed visibly, each beat sending shockwaves through the floor and walls, interacting with our own heartbeats in a perverse symphony. Macro cliffhanger. I realized that the entire room functioned as a conduit, the grafted bodies and instruments channeling warp energy outward, shaping reality itself. My squad tried to catalog the anomalies systematically, but sensory overload made precision difficult. Gravity varied across the room. Some corners seemed to pull us downward while others offered no resistance. Shadows behaved independently of light sources, stretching and twisting into humanoid forms that mimicked our movements, but with subtle distortions, extra joints. Elongated limbs, heads tilted at impossible angles. Micro cliffhanger. One shadow detached from the wall and lunged at Calum, passing through him with no contact, yet he staggered as though struck by an invisible force. The grafted bodies reacted to our presence. Eyes opened and closed in unison, watching, memorizing. Limbs twitched as if they could strike at will, though none moved beyond the ritual configuration. A low, wet hiss accompanied every pulse of the altar, and whispers filled our minds. Fragmented prayers, chants, warnings. "The feast is incomplete," the voices repeated, harmonizing with the hive's heartbeat. The phrase began to echo inside my skull, layering over itself until I could scarcely distinguish thought from suggestion. We attempted to move closer to the altar. Compelled by both duty and the subtle pull of warp energy, each step required conscious effort. The floor seemed to resist us, contracting and expanding unpredictably. I observed a pattern in the grafted bodies. Their placement mirrored the altar's runes, forming concentric nodes that pulsed with energy. The room was not static. It adapted, evolved, and actively responded to our actions. Macro cliffhanger. I realized the soul butchers were not just performing a ritual, they were shaping reality, using the grafted bodies to construct a warp lattice capable of reaching beyond the planet. One of the instruments on the altar shifted as we approached. A bone saw vibrated in resonance with the altar, producing a frequency that made our teeth ache. Micro cliffhanger. Jaren, mesmerized, stepped forward to touch it, and I caught him just in time. The saw flinched violently, tearing the air with a high-pitched screech, and a pulse of warp energy surged through the room, making every grafted body twitch violently. The hum intensified to a roar that seemed to emanate from the walls, floor, and ceiling simultaneously. The environmental conditions worsened. Cold blasts of air erupted from hidden vents, followed by sudden warmth that left frostbite on exposed skin. Gravity shifted unpredictably, sometimes lifting us slightly, sometimes pinning us harder against the floor. Shadows flickered independently, sometimes mimicking us perfectly, sometimes diverging grotesquely. The room was alive, sentient, and aware of our every action. Micro cliffhanger. A portion of the floor opened beneath Calum, revealing a pit lined with contracting sinews, sucking at the air as if it were a mouth. I dragged him back, narrowly avoiding consumption. We reached the threshold of the altar itself. Telemetry readings confirmed the macro cliffhanger. The warp lattice was nearly complete, converging at the central node. The Soul Butchers had designed a network, each grafted body a relay point, each instrument a tuner, and we were caught in the final stages of their design. The pulse of the altar seemed to synchronize with our own heartbeats, and I felt the edges of my perception bending, the world fracturing into something alien and incomprehensible. I ordered the squad to maintain formation, though I knew the hive could manipulate our senses, bend time and space, and warp reality itself. The altar awaited. Whatever the Soul Butchers intended, it would be revealed here, and I understood with clinical precision and growing dread that passing this point would irrevocably alter everything. The hum, the whispers, the pulsing flesh, everything coalesced into a single undeniable fact. We were witnesses to a ritual that was not just feeding on flesh, but on reality itself. The altar's pulse was a living rhythm that matched the thrum of my own heart, and I realized with cold certainty that every grafted body in the chamber was linked to it, a node in a lattice of flesh, bone, and brass. Telemetry confirmed what I already suspected. The Soul Butchers were not just performing a ritual, they were tuning the warp itself, shaping it with instruments, graphs, and sacrificial geometry. The low hum vibrated through the soles of my boots, my teeth, my chest, leaving a resonance that made even the simplest thought a challenge. We advanced cautiously, laser guns raised, boots crunching against the elastic, pulsating floor. Each step elicited subtle twitches from the walls, grafted limbs curling slightly as if in anticipation. One body, fused into a brass conduit, emitted a wet hiss, a single tortured exhalation that echoed against the impossible geometry of the chamber. The smell of ozone and blood thickened, stinging nostrils and coating our throats with iron tang. Micro cliffhanger. Private Jaren staggered, convulsing as the pulse of the altar interacted with his own bioelectric field, leaving him gasping and disoriented. Closer inspection of the instruments revealed their impossible complexity. Bone saws vibrated in harmony with the pulsing grafted nodes. Clamps twitched in sync with the warp lattice. Some of the instruments were partially organic, sinews entwined with brass and servo motors, and faint whispering seemed to emanate directly from them. I noted each anomaly with clinical precision, knowing that comprehension alone was a form of survival here. Macro cliffhanger. Partial analysis indicated that these instruments could manipulate not only flesh, but also psychic perception, potentially bending the minds of any observer into compliance with the feast. Calum, recovering from the earlier convulsion, pointed to a section of the altar that was unlike the others. It was a nexus of grafted bodies, more intricate, more organic than anything else in the room. Eyes blinked in unison. Mechanical limbs twitched with coordinated precision, and sinews pulsed with a frequency that resonated with the warp lattice itself. Micro cliffhanger. A single arm detached, reaching toward Calum before retracting violently, leaving a smear of black ichor. He shuddered visibly, muttering prayers he did not remember knowing. The room itself had begun to behave unpredictably. Gravity shifted subtly, pulling us unevenly across the floor. Shadows twisted independently, sometimes forming humanoid shapes with limbs that bent in impossible ways. The grafted bodies responded, their motions synchronizing with our movements as though the hive were learning from us. Micro cliffhanger. A small cluster of grafted torsos convulsed violently, expelling a fine mist that burned lungs and eyes, forcing us to back away. I approached the instruments cautiously. My hands hovered over the bone saws, tracing the inscriptions in a barely audible whisper of low Gothic. The runes shimmered, vibrating in sympathy with the warp lattice. The hum intensified, responding to my proximity as though aware of my intent. Macro cliffhanger. Partial telemetry indicated that even minimal contact could channel the warp lattice's energy into the user, bending flesh, mind, or soul to the hive's will. This was no longer observation. We had become part of the ritual by merely standing here. One of the instruments, a serrated clamp fused with sinew and brass, shuddered violently. Micro cliffhanger. It extended toward Jaren, grasping the air around him with impossible precision. He jerked backward, but the clamp retracted, leaving a lingering pulse that seemed to imprint itself onto his nervous system. The room responded in kind. Grafted bodies twitched, shadows elongated, and the hum shifted into a low, undulating scream that penetrated skulls directly. We were forced to acknowledge a terrifying truth. The soul butchers had constructed a living network, and we were now nodes within it. The ritual was not static. It adapted, reacted, and learned. Micro cliffhanger. Calum touched a partially grafted wall, and for an instant, I glimpsed the hive's perspective, a vast lattice of consciousness composed of pain, machinery, and devotion, calculating each of our actions, anticipating every step. Desperation mounted as we attempted to secure the room and contain the immediate threats. Micro cliffhanger. A grafted torso convulsed and ejected a jet of warp-tainted fluid, coating the floor and the nearest wall with a corrosive sheen. The taste of iron filled the air, and I felt my own blood pressure spike, synchronized with the room's pulse. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry indicated that the warp lattice was approaching critical resonance. The soul butchers were not merely performing a feast. They were completing a conduit capable of manifesting the warp into real space. The hum had become a deafening presence. Shadows now moved with agency, some detaching entirely from walls to mimic our motions. Micro cliffhanger. One shadow lunged at me, passing through the armor as a chilling distortion in perception, leaving me reeling. I noted each sensory anomaly meticulously, understanding that survival required acute awareness of both physical and psychic hazards. A final observation confirmed the full scope of the horror. The grafted nodes were arranged in concentric patterns, perfectly mirroring the inscriptions on the instruments. Energy readings indicated a feedback loop forming between the altar, the grafted bodies, and us, the living intruders. Macro cliffhanger. The lattice was nearly complete, and the final stage of the feast was imminent. Once fully resonant, it would not simply feed. It would expand, bending reality and consuming all life in its vicinity. I gave the squad a terse order: maintain formation. Micro cliffhanger. As we prepared to advance further, a single grafted arm detached and pointed toward a side corridor, flickering like a warning. The whispers crescendoed, repeating our names. The phrase, "The feast is incomplete," and a single command: contribute or perish. Macro cliffhanger. We realized that the next chamber would be both a battleground and a nexus, where our presence would be tested against the soul butcher's full ritual power. There was no turning back, and whatever lay ahead promised to unmake us, or worse, transform us into part of the hive itself. The side corridor that the grafted arm had indicated was narrow, impossibly long and slick, with a combination of moisture and something organic I could not name. The hum of the warp lattice grew louder as we advanced, reverberating through the walls, the floor, and even our armor. Each step felt like a negotiation, gravity subtly shifting beneath our boots, tugging, releasing, pulling in unpredictable directions. I had trained for hostile terrain, but nothing prepared me for corridors that seemed to think, adapt, and resist our movement. Private Calum led the way, scanning the walls with his shoulder-mounted sensor. The grafted tissue here was more elaborate than anything in the central chamber. Sinews intertwined with mechanical tubing, eyes blinking intermittently, as if studying us. Each pattern of flesh and brass pulsed in a rhythm slightly offset from the main lattice, creating a dissonant echo I could feel in my chest. Micro cliffhanger. A cluster of eyes separated from the wall, following Calum independently before returning seamlessly to the surface, like an organism observing and cataloging its prey. We pressed forward, laser guns raised, voices hushed to avoid attracting attention from whatever consciousness animated this corridor. Shadows flickered across the walls, moving counter to the light, Sometimes they mimicked our own motions. Other times they diverged grotesquely, forming figures with elongated limbs and heads twisted at impossible angles. The floor pulsed gently beneath us, and I realized that every movement we made was being recorded, anticipated, and fed back into the hive's calculations. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed the lattice here was actively extending, linking our presence to the main ritual nodes in real time. The first fully animated grafted victims appeared suddenly, limbs detached from walls, sinews contracting as torsos rose from the floor. They were grotesque parodies of human form. Mechanical components fused to bones, eyes observing independently of sockets, mouths opening impossibly wide in silent screams. Micro cliffhanger. One figure lunged at Calum, passing through his armor as a distortion in perception, leaving him doubled over in convulsive terror. Laser gun fire had no effect. The beings were partially warped, partially mechanized, and entirely unfeeling. I ordered the squad into formation. We advanced cautiously, using suppressive fire as a psychological tool rather than an offensive one, aware that the corridor itself reacted to every shot, pulse, and vibration. Each step elicited a subtle twitch from the grafted tissue, walls bending and contracting as if to herded us toward the center of the corridor. Sensory overload was constant. The smell of iron and ozone, the wet hissing of grafted bodies, the low hum penetrating bone and mind. Micro cliffhanger. Calum screamed as the floor beneath him opened slightly, revealing tendrils that sought to entangle him. I yanked him free just in time. We reached a junction where the corridor split into multiple paths, each pulsing differently, each vibrating with distinct warp frequencies. The lattice here seemed to choose a path for us, subtly influencing movement through gravitational microshifts and psychic suggestion. I noted clinically that this was no accident. The hive was intelligent, adaptive, and actively manipulating our perceptions and instincts. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry indicated the corridor's grafted nodes were forming a subnetwork, feeding energy back toward the altar and accelerating the completion of the main ritual. The grafted victims advanced, moving with impossible fluidity. Limbs elongated to reach across the corridor, eyes tracking from multiple angles, and mechanical components whirred in synchronized rhythm with the warp lattice. Micro cliffhanger. One torso detached from a wall, pivoting on a joint that should not have existed, and lunged at me. It passed through Calum, leaving him unharmed but visibly shaken. The sensation of incorporeal attack left a lasting imprint on our nervous systems, a reminder that physical defenses were meaningless here. We pressed forward, forced to navigate a series of twists and inclines that contradicted all known schematics. Gravity shifted mid-step, pulling us downward or sideways unpredictably, while shadows flickered independently, occasionally detaching to form new shapes. Micro cliffhanger. A small cluster of grafted torsos convulsed violently, expelling a fine mist that burned lungs and eyes, forcing us to back away. The room responded instantly, walls contracting and pulling slightly closer, directing us toward a partially obscured side chamber. I realized that the corridor itself was a predator, its architecture alive and aware. The micro cliffhangers were not random. They were probes, tests, conditioning. The macro cliffhanger became clear. Every movement we made was accelerating the completion of the warp lattice. We were not intruders. We were components feeding energy, guiding the lattice into its final form. To survive, we would need to manipulate the hive's perception without triggering its full response, a task I doubted any training could prepare us for. The side chamber ahead emitted a higher frequency hum, a distinct variation from the main lattice. It was both beacon and warning. Micro cliffhanger. Calum tripped over what appeared to be a grafted foot protruding from the floor. As he stumbled, the limb twitched violently as though alive, and released a low-frequency vibration that rattled our teeth and ears. The corridor's walls flexed subtly, closing gaps and narrowing our path, forcing us into alignment with the chamber entrance. As we approached, the hum intensified, synchronizing with our own heartbeats, embedding a pattern into the mind that made hesitation increasingly dangerous. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed that the subnetwork formed in this corridor had successfully integrated into the main lattice. Whatever the soul butchers were constructing, it was now semi-aware, adaptive, and capable of influencing perception and physiology beyond the immediate chamber. Our next step would bring us directly into the nexus of their ritual, where the full power of the feast awaited. The side chamber opened into a vast, cathedral-like hall, walls stretching impossibly high, lined with grafted flesh interwoven with brass conduits and mechanical tubing. The hum of the warp lattice escalated into a resonance that pressed against my skull, forcing my thoughts into jagged fragments. Each pulse seemed to anticipate our movements, as if the hive itself was aware of every instinct, every hesitation. I realized that what lay ahead was not simply a continuation of the ritual. It was the central mechanism of the feast itself. The altar dominated the room, larger and more intricate than any I had previously observed. Crafted bodies spiraled upward, sinews twisting into brass frameworks, torsos fused with mechanical instruments that vibrated in synchrony with the warp lattice. The pulse of the altar seemed to transmit directly into our nervous systems, embedding a rhythm that overlaid our own heartbeats. Micro cliffhanger. Private Calum staggered as the pulse aligned with his bioelectric field, leaving him dazed, muttering prayers that had no context yet resonated with the chamber. Closer inspection revealed that the instruments were not inert. Bone saws, clamps, and syringes twitched subtly, reacting to our presence, to our movement, to the very thoughts we could not suppress. Micro cliffhanger. A serrated clamp extended from the altar and grasped at Jaren's arm, stopping millimeters from contact, then retracted violently, leaving him pale and trembling. Each micro-movement reinforced the hive's power, transmitting energy back into the warp lattice as though the ritual was learning, calibrating, evolving. The walls themselves were alive. Grafted torsos flexed in impossible rhythms, some detaching partially to observe us, then melding seamlessly back into the wall. Shadows flickered independently, sometimes mimicking our movements, sometimes diverging into grotesque parodies with extra limbs or warped heads. Micro cliffhanger. One shadow lunged at me, passing through my armor without contact, leaving an icy impression on my spine, a psychic sting that made my teeth chatter and thoughts fragment. The floor pulsed, rising and falling subtly, elastic yet firm underfoot, guiding us toward the altar in increments so slight that only repeated observation revealed its effect. Micro cliffhanger. Calum stumbled over what appeared to be a grafted tendon protruding from the floor. As he fell, the tendril contracted, releasing a wave of warp energy that rattled our senses and left a faint taste of iron in the mouth. Every step forward was a negotiation, each movement feeding energy into the lattice, accelerating the feast toward completion. Telemetry confirmed the macro cliffhanger. The instruments, the grafted nodes, and our own bioelectric presence were fully integrated into the warp lattice. Whatever the soul butchers were performing, it was no longer static. It was dynamic, adaptive, capable of influencing perception, physiology, and reality itself. The entire chamber acted as a psychic amplifier, and we were trapped within its resonance. We attempted to approach the altar systematically, cautious of both the grafted bodies and the instruments. The pulse intensified with each step, vibrating through bone, muscle, and armor. Micro cliffhanger. A cluster of grafted torsos convulsed violently, expelling a fine mist that burned lungs and eyes, forcing us to retreat temporarily. Shadows elongated, merging with the instruments to form shapes that were neither fully human nor machine, yet clearly aware, clearly alive, and clearly hostile. The instruments themselves began to react more aggressively. Bone saws vibrated in harmony with the lattice, mechanical clamps twitched in anticipation, and syringes extended slightly, as though seeking contact. Micro cliffhanger. Jaren, mesmerized, reached toward a saw. I grabbed his arm just in time. The instrument recoiled violently, releasing a shockwave of warp energy that reverberated through the chamber, throwing us against the walls and floor. The pulse of the lattice accelerated, synchronizing with the rhythm of our own fear and physiological responses. We realized with clinical horror that the soul butchers had designed a conduit not just for feeding, but for manifesting warp energy into real space. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry indicated that the lattice was near full resonance, capable of projecting the ritual's effects outward, potentially breaching containment beyond Korvax 9. Our presence, intended as observation or interference, had become an integral component of the feast. Every heartbeat, every movement, every thought contributed to the lattice's growth and stability. The grafted bodies reacted dynamically to our collective tension. Limbs extended, eyes followed, and sinews pulsed in rhythm with the instruments. Micro cliffhanger. One torso detached fully, lunging toward Calum with impossible speed, before melting seamlessly back into the wall. The entire chamber vibrated with the sensation of being both watched and evaluated. The hive judging our suitability as participants or victims in the next phase of the feast. A low, wet hiss emerged from the altar itself, accompanied by a vibration that I could feel through my teeth and sternum. Shadows detached from the walls entirely, forming humanoid shapes that mirrored our squad but with grotesque distortions. Heads twisted, limbs elongated, mouths gaping in silent screams. Micro cliffhanger. One shadow struck at me, passing through flesh and armor alike, leaving a lingering psychic sting. The chamber reacted instantly, walls flexing, instruments twitching, and the warp lattice pulsing violently in response. We stood at the threshold of total immersion, where the instrument's influence, the grafted nodes, and the warp lattice converged. Macro cliffhanger. The final stage of the ritual was imminent. The Soul Butcher's feast would either consume reality itself or transform all present into integral nodes within the lattice. We had no choice but to advance, to interact with the altar, and to confront the horror that had been methodically preparing itself for our arrival. Every moment delayed was a moment of feeding for the hive, and every step forward was a step into a nexus that could bend mind, flesh, and reality beyond recognition. The moment we crossed the threshold closer to the altar, the chamber itself seemed to inhale, drawing every breath into a resonant void. The warp lattice had reached a point of active aggression, projecting pulses that assaulted not just the body, but the mind. The hum escalated into a high-pitched keening that threaded itself into our consciousness, fragmenting thought into shards. Micro cliffhanger. Calum dropped to his knees, convulsing, as the lattice interacted with his nervous system directly, synapses firing in chaotic resonance with the pulse of the grafted nodes. The grafted bodies responded violently, limbs detached, twisting in midair with impossible geometry, tendrils extending toward the squad with intent, yet passing through physical space without resistance. Micro cliffhanger. One torso's head pivoted completely backward, eyes unblinking, and it seemed to leer into Calum's mind, transmitting an image of a grotesque banquet in perpetual motion. The vision struck him mute, frozen, a living tableau of horror he could not comprehend or resist. I ordered the squad into a defensive perimeter, laser guns raised, though the weapons were meaningless against the assault on perception. Gravity fluctuated unpredictably, lifting us slightly, then slamming us back with a subtle, invisible force. Shadows detached from the walls entirely, taking forms both human and alien. Micro cliffhanger. One shadow struck Jaren, passing through him with no contact, leaving a lingering psychic sting that made his limbs twitch uncontrollably. The instruments on the altar were now fully active. Bone saws vibrated in resonance with the warp lattice. Mechanical clamps extended and retracted with rhythmic precision, synchronized with our bioelectric fields. Micro cliffhanger. A serrated saw lunged toward my arm, stopping millimeters from contact, and I felt the lattice's influence reach directly into my own perception, distorting time, space, and bodily awareness for a moment that lasted much longer than it should have. Environmental anomalies intensified. The walls flexed, contracting and expanding subtly, guiding us like prey toward the ritual's center. Temperature oscillated violently. Sudden blasts of cold left frost on our visors, followed by stifling heat that left sweat running in rivulets beneath armor. Micro cliffhanger. A patch of grafted floor shifted, lifting Calum slightly before dropping him abruptly, eliciting a scream that echoed unnaturally in the chamber, as if the lattice amplified sound in both frequency and duration. The warp lattice projected a psychic waveform now, and the squad's minds were assaulted by overlapping visions, screaming faces, impossible geometries, flashes of flesh and brass in ritual alignment. Macro cliffhanger. I realized clinically that the lattice was attempting to imprint our consciousness into itself, to convert our perception, thoughts, and fear into energy feeding the Soul Butcher's feast. Every hesitation, every heartbeat, every minor movement was being converted into power. A cluster of grafted bodies convulsed violently, detaching partially to attack. Micro cliffhanger. One torso lunged at Jaren, passing through him and leaving a residual psychic echo, a sensation of pain and fear that lingered long after the contact. The entire chamber seemed to respond instantaneously, walls flexing, shadows elongating, and instruments vibrating in reaction to the psychic imprint left by our fear. The altar pulsed visibly, synchronizing with the warp lattice and the grafted nodes. I noted clinically that the pulse affected both physiology and perception, accelerating heart rates, destabilizing balance, and amplifying fear into a tangible, manipulable substance. Micro cliffhanger. The lattice projected a secondary waveform that briefly merged our individual perceptions, creating a collective hallucination in which the squad appeared fused into a single grotesque node of sinew, bone, and brass. The image shattered consciousness temporarily, leaving disorientation in its wake. Telemetric readings confirmed the macro cliffhanger. The lattice was near full resonance, projecting energy outward, capable of extending its influence beyond Corvax 9 if allowed to complete the ritual. The Soul Butcher's feast was no longer contained. We had become integral components, feeding energy and guiding the lattice toward completion through fear, perception, and bioelectric signature. The instrument's influence, grafted bodies, and environmental manipulation converged into a single, semi-conscious system of control. The squad attempted to regroup. Micro cliffhanger. Shadows flickered independently, forming humanoid shapes that mimicked our positions, then diverged grotesquely, striking at our senses directly rather than the body. Calum staggered, unable to distinguish reality from the projected psychic distortions. The floor rose and fell beneath us in waves. Tendrils protruded from the walls, testing our reactions, reinforcing the hive's predictive algorithm. As we approached the central node of the altar, the intensity peaked. Macro cliffhanger. The warp lattice resonated at a level that threatened to fracture perception entirely. The Soul Butchers were drawing directly from our fear, our neural activity, and our presence in a feedback loop. Every pulse was amplified, every scream reflected and magnified, every step measured, cataloged, and returned to the hive's consciousness. The next moment would determine whether we survived, became nodes, or were consumed outright. I issued terse commands, focusing the squad's attention on discipline, formation, and observation. Yet the psychic assault left gaps in comprehension. Micro cliffhanger. One instrument on the altar vibrated violently, projecting a pulse through Jaren that left him doubled over, convulsing, as though his body were being rewritten in the lattice's image. The chamber's walls flexed in response, shadows twisting and merging with instruments, every element acting in concert to complete the feast's design. We had reached the brink. Macro cliffhanger. The Soul Butcher's ritual was poised to climax, the warp lattice nearly complete, and the chamber now an active predator. The next steps would force a choice between survival, interference, or becoming an integral component of the hive itself, as the feast readied to consume reality, or us, as part of its expansion. The chamber had become a living organism, its heartbeat synchronized with ours. Each pulse of the warp lattice reverberated through bone, muscle, and nervous tissue, embedding the ritual's rhythm directly into our perception. Micro cliffhanger. Calum cried out as the lattice projected a vision directly into his mind, his own body twisting into a grotesque node of flesh and brass. His limbs stretching impossibly while mechanical clamps fused to sinews. He collapsed, shaking violently, unable to distinguish hallucination from reality. The grafted bodies reacted instantly to our distress. Limbs detached from walls, torsos twisted in impossible angles, eyes rotating independently to track us. Micro cliffhanger. A cluster of torsos lunged at Jaren, passing through him and leaving a lingering psychic imprint that caused tremors across his motor functions. The walls flexed subtly, pulling shadows toward us, shaping light and darkness into predatory forms. The instruments on the altar vibrated violently in response, amplifying the warp energy and projecting it through the chamber. We moved forward, but each step was a negotiation with reality itself. Gravity fluctuated unpredictably. Floor sections rose and fell as if inhaling, exhaling, testing our balance and coordination. Micro cliffhanger. A grafted tendril erupted from the floor beneath Calum, curling around his leg before retracting violently, leaving him gasping for breath, skin slick with cold sweat. The hive was not merely observing, it was interacting, manipulating, and conditioning, making every motion feed its power. The altar's instruments pulsed with increasing frequency. Bone saws vibrated in synchronization with the lattice. Mechanical clamps extended and retracted like predatory limbs, and syringes twitched toward the squad as though tasting our bioelectric signatures. Micro cliffhanger. I reached toward a runed saw to examine it, and for a fleeting moment, the lattice projected an image of my own body being absorbed into the hive, fused with grafted nodes, the experience physically and psychically real. My squad flinched, aware that observing was already participating. Shadows moved independently of light. Micro cliffhanger. One elongated shape lunged at Calum, striking him psychically rather than physically, forcing him to stagger, dazed, vision fracturing with images of impossible geometries, screaming faces, and twisting sinews. The hive's influence penetrated beyond the material, embedding itself into thought and sensory processing. Every micro cliffhanger compounded into a constant assault on perception, leaving the squad disoriented yet compelled to advance. Telemetric readings confirmed the macro cliffhanger. The warp lattice had reached near total resonance, integrating instruments, grafted nodes, and our presence into a unified feedback loop. The Soul Butcher's feast was no longer a ritual. It was a semi-conscious entity capable of manipulating time, space, and perception to achieve its feeding. Every heartbeat, every tremor, every fearful glance contributed to its growth. We pressed forward toward the altar's central node, but the chamber itself had become hostile. Floors contracted and expanded unpredictably, walls bent subtly, guiding us toward predatory positions. Shadows elongated, merging with grafted bodies to form composite attackers. Micro cliffhanger. A torso detached fully, lunging at me with mechanical precision, before retracting into the wall, leaving an afterimage of pain and fear imprinted on my nervous system. Each action we took fed the hive's calculations, predicting responses and adapting in real time. Calum whimpered, clutching his head. Micro cliffhanger. The lattice projected an image into his mind, a vision of the feast consuming him and his squad mates, their bodies fused into an endless node of sinew, brass, and mechanical instruments. He screamed, yet the image lingered in our collective consciousness, a shared hallucination that we could neither dismiss nor escape. The chamber's hum rose to a frequency that pressed against teeth, bone, and mind, embedding the ritual's rhythm into every thought. The grafted bodies convulsed violently, responding to the squad's collective fear. Limbs extended in ways that defied physics, eyes rotated independently, and sinews pulsed as if testing the strength of each of us. Micro cliffhanger. Jaren staggered as a detached limb passed through him, leaving a psychic imprint that caused tremors in his motor functions. The lattice adapted instantly, modulating amplitude and frequency to maximize psychological and physiological stress. Approaching the altar's core, the instruments reacted aggressively. Bone saws vibrated violently, mechanical clamps reached outward, and syringes extended toward our armor, almost seeking bioelectric contact. Micro cliffhanger. Calum reached forward involuntarily, drawn by the lattice's psychic pull, and I grabbed him just in time. The instrument recoiled, sending a shockwave of warp energy through the chamber, rattling walls and distorting the remaining shadows. I noted clinically that our very presence had become an integral component of the ritual. The macro cliffhanger was clear. The Soul Butcher's lattice was nearly complete. Once fully resonant, it would project warp energy outward, consuming perception, consciousness, and potentially reality itself. We were no longer intruders. We were fuel, nodes, contributors to the ritual's expansion, and the hive's semi-conscious network now calculated the next phase. The chamber's environment became violently dynamic. Temperature oscillated rapidly. Sudden blasts of heat left sweat running down armor, followed by freezing cold that numbed fingers and toes. Micro cliffhanger. A grafted tendon erupted from the floor beneath me, curling toward my ankle before retracting violently, leaving a lingering sensation of cold and pressure. Shadows detached completely, forming humanoid shapes that lunged and recoiled, testing our reflexes, feeding the lattice with our reactions. The final approach to the altar's core was imminent. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed full integration of subnetworks and the squad's bioelectric presence into the warp lattice. The Soul Butcher's feast was prepared to reach full resonance. Every heartbeat, every micro-movement, every sensory reaction had been calculated and fed into a feedback loop. The next stage promised transformation, consumption or survival at unimaginable cost. The chamber awaited, alive, aware, and hungry. The altar's pulse had become unbearable, a living rhythm that resonated directly with our hearts and minds. The warp lattice was now fully aware of us, not just observing, but integrating our presence into its design. Every breath, every heartbeat, every subtle movement fed its growth, shaping the reality of the chamber in response. Micro cliffhanger. Calum collapsed to his knees as the lattice projected an image of his own body twisting into a grotesque fusion of sinew, brass, and mechanical instruments, convulsing uncontrollably in psychic feedback. The grafted bodies convulsed violently in response, limbs detaching and twisting independently, eyes rotating with mechanical precision to follow our every motion. Micro cliffhanger. A torso lunged toward Jaren, phasing through him without contact, leaving a residual psychic imprint that caused tremors in his motor functions. The walls flexed subtly, drawing shadows into predatory formations, shaping light and darkness into weaponized perception. The altar's instruments were now fully animate. Bone saws vibrated in precise harmony with the warp lattice. Mechanical clamps extended and retracted, and syringes twitched toward our armor. Micro cliffhanger. A serrated saw lunged toward my arm, stopping millimeters from contact, and I felt the lattice project an image of my own body merging with grafted nodes, a hallucination physically and psychically real. The squad flinched, recognizing that even observation had made us participants. Environmental anomalies escalated. Gravity shifted unpredictably. Floors rose and fell like lungs. Walls contracted and expanded subtly, directing our movements toward the altar. Micro cliffhanger. A grafted tendon erupted beneath Calum, curling around his leg before retracting violently, leaving him gasping for breath and coated in cold sweat. Every motion we took was being monitored, measured, and converted into energy for the lattice. The warp lattice projected psychic waves into each squad member. Micro cliffhanger. Calum experienced a shared hallucination of the feast consuming the squad. Their bodies fused into a grotesque node of sinew and brass. His scream echoed unnaturally, amplified by the chamber and embedded into our collective perception. The hum intensified, embedding the ritual's rhythm into our thoughts, fragmenting awareness into shards of terror. The grafted bodies reacted dynamically, limbs extended impossibly, eyes rotated independently, and sinews pulsed in rhythm with the altar. Micro cliffhanger. Jaren staggered as a detached limb passed through him, leaving a psychic imprint that caused tremors in his nervous system. The chamber itself flexed, adapting to our presence, predictive and sentient. We approached the altar's central node. Micro cliffhanger, one of the altar's instruments. A bone clamp lunged at Jaren, then recoiled violently, sending a shockwave of warp energy through the chamber, distorting shadows and twisting the grafted bodies in response. Each micro-action contributed to the hive's calculations, feeding the lattice with fear, motion, and bioelectric signature. The macro cliffhanger became undeniable. Telemetry confirmed that the warp lattice had reached near total resonance, integrating all grafted nodes, instruments, and the squad's presence into a unified feedback loop. The Soul Butcher's feast was no longer just a ritual. It was a semi-conscious adaptive system capable of reshaping perception, manipulating physics, and consuming or transforming reality itself. Every micro-movement, every physiological response, every thought fed the lattice's growth and stability. Shadows detached entirely from the walls, forming humanoid shapes with grotesque distortions, elongated limbs, twisted heads, mouths agape, and silent screams. Micro cliffhanger. One shadow struck at Calum psychically rather than physically, leaving him staggered and disoriented, his vision fragmented with impossible geometries and flickering faces. The chamber's hum reached a level that vibrated through teeth, sternum, and skull, embedding the ritual's rhythm into every nerve ending. The grafted bodies and instruments responded to fear with violent synchronicity. Limbs lashed, torsos twisted, eyes rotated independently, and instruments projected pulses that attacked nervous systems directly. Micro cliffhanger. Calum was pulled involuntarily toward a serrated saw by the lattice's psychic influence, and I grabbed him just in time. The saw recoiled, releasing a shockwave that distorted the shadows, rattled the floor, and left residual echoes of fear embedded in our perception. We were trapped in a nexus where environmental, psychic, and ritualized forces converged. Macro cliffhanger. The warp lattice's resonance had reached critical mass. The Soul Butcher's feast was poised to manifest fully, consuming, transforming, or fusing all present into integral nodes of its semi-conscious system. Survival required discipline, focus, and calculation. Hesitation ensured assimilation. The altar pulsed with malignant purpose. Micro cliffhanger. A grafted torso convulsed, ejecting warp-tainted fluid into the air, causing eyes to burn and lungs to tighten. Shadows merged with instruments and grafted nodes, forming predatory composite figures that stalked our senses rather than our bodies. Every reaction, every micro-movement, every spike in heart rate fed the lattice, accelerating the feast toward completion. We reached the final threshold, where the altar's central node glowed with concentrated warp energy. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed full integration of all subnetworks and squad bioelectric presence. The Soul Butcher's feast was prepared to reach maximum resonance. The next moment would determine whether we survived, became nodes, or were consumed outright. The chamber awaited, alive, aware, and insatiably hungry. The altar's pulse had reached a frequency that penetrated every fiber of our bodies. The warp lattice now actively reached into neural pathways, manipulating perception, motor function, and even the sensation of self. Micro cliffhanger. Calum screamed as his limbs elongated involuntarily, sinews fusing with invisible strands of warp energy. His cry echoed in the chamber, amplified and layered over the hum of the altar, embedding a tactile vibration into our bones. Grafted bodies convulsed violently, limbs detached completely, twisting in impossible angles, eyes rotating independently, some forming additional sets on torsos where none should exist. Micro cliffhanger. A torso lunged at Jaren, phasing through him with no physical resistance, leaving a residual psychic imprint that caused his muscles to spasm unpredictably. Shadows flickered, forming humanoid shapes that mimicked us with subtle distortions, exaggerating features and movements in grotesque symmetry. The altar's instruments had become fully sentient in their interaction with the lattice. Bone saws vibrated at high frequencies, mechanical clamps extended and retracted like predatory limbs, and syringes probed the air for bioelectric contact. Micro cliffhanger. A serrated clamp lunged toward my arm, stopping millimeters from contact, projecting an image of my own body merging with the grafted nodes in the hive. I staggered back, recognizing that mere observation had made us participants. The environment fluctuated violently. Gravity shifted unpredictably. Floors pulsed like lungs, walls contracted and expanded subtly, channeling our movements toward the altar. Micro cliffhanger. A grafted tendon erupted beneath Calum, wrapping partially around his leg before retracting violently, leaving him disoriented and slick with sweat. Each movement, each heartbeat, each micro-reaction contributed energy to the lattice, accelerating the Soul Butcher's feast. The warp lattice projected targeted psychic waves. Micro cliffhanger. Calum experienced a shared hallucination of the feast consuming us, our bodies fusing into grotesque nodes of sinew, brass, and mechanical instruments. His scream penetrated our perception, a living sound that amplified fear and reinforced the lattice's resonance. The hum embedded itself into thought, fragmenting cognition and reducing perception to a series of discrete pulses in rhythm with the altar. Grafted nodes reacted dynamically, limbs extended impossibly, eyes rotated independently, torsos twisted with purpose, anticipating movement and fear. Micro cliffhanger. Jaren staggered as a detached limb passed through him, leaving a psychic imprint that made his motor responses erratic. The hive was no longer observing. It was integrating, calculating, and reshaping us in real time. As we neared the central node, the instruments reacted aggressively. Bone saws vibrated in synchronization with the lattice. Clamps extended and retracted rapidly. Syringes projected toward our armor, seeking bioelectric resonance. Micro cliffhanger. Calum, drawn involuntarily toward a saw by psychic pull, was yanked back by my hand just in time. The saw recoiled, releasing a pulse that distorted shadows, rattled the floor, and left lingering echoes of fear in our nervous systems. We were trapped in a nexus of environmental, psychic, and ritualized assault. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed near-total lattice resonance, integrating instruments, grafted nodes, and the squad's bioelectric presence into a semi-conscious feedback loop. The feast was no longer merely a ritual. It was an entity capable of reshaping reality, consuming perception and transforming biological matter. Every micro-reaction accelerated its completion. Shadows detached entirely, forming humanoid shapes with grotesque distortions, elongated limbs, warped heads, mouths agape in silent screams. Micro-cliffhanger. One shadow struck Calum psychically, leaving him staggered, vision fracturing into impossible geometries, flickering faces and undulating sinews. The chamber's hum reached a frequency that resonated through teeth, sternum and skull, embedding the ritual's rhythm into every nerve ending, reducing perception to vibration and fear. Grafted bodies and instruments responded in perfect coordination. Limbs lashed, torsos twisted, eyes rotated independently, and instruments projected psychic pulses that assaulted nervous systems directly. Micro-cliffhanger. Calum's body was partially drawn toward a serrated saw by lattice projection, and I intervened, pulling him back. The instrument recoiled violently, sending a shockwave through the chamber, distorting shadows, rattling floors, and leaving residual psychic echoes. We were no longer intruders but nodes within the lattice. Macro-cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed full integration of all subnetworks and squad bioelectric presence. The Soul Butcher's feast had reached critical resonance. The chamber now acted as predator and conduit, capable of consuming, transforming, or fusing all present into integral components of the warp lattice. The next moment would decide whether we survived, were assimilated, or became permanent nodes in this semi-conscious system. The altar pulsed with malignant purpose, projecting waves of warp energy in rhythm with the lattice and our own neural activity. Micro-cliffhanger. A grafted torso convulsed violently, ejecting warp-tainted fluid into the air, burning eyes and lungs, forcing Calum to stagger backward. Shadows merged with instruments and nodes, forming predatory composites that attacked senses rather than flesh, embedding fear directly into the nervous system. Every reaction, every heartbeat, every movement fed the lattice, accelerating the feast's completion. We had reached the final threshold. Macro-cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed full resonance, full integration, and full awareness of our presence by the lattice. The Soul Butcher's feast was poised to manifest fully. Every micro-action, every emotional spike, every breath contributed to its growth. The chamber awaited, alive, aware, and insatiably hungry, ready to convert us, consume us, or transform us into permanent nodes of its semi-conscious network. The chamber had become a crucible, every pulse of the warp lattice embedding itself deeper into nervous tissue, perception, and motor function. Micro-cliffhanger. Calum convulsed violently as his flesh began to twist, sinews lengthening, joints realigning into geometries impossible in natural anatomy. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed and amplified by the altar, layered with other voices, creating a cacophony that fractured my concentration. Grafted bodies responded with predatory precision, limbs detached and struck in patterns calculated to provoke fear. Torsos twisted and reoriented themselves mid-air, and eyes rotated independently, following every micro-movement of the squad. Micro-cliffhanger. One torso lunged at Jaren, phasing through him completely, leaving a psychic imprint that forced his muscles into involuntary spasm, bending limbs at unnatural angles. Shadows flickered and merged with grafted nodes, forming distorted reflections of our forms, exaggerating every motion grotesquely. The instruments on the altar had achieved sentience in their interaction with the warp lattice. Bone saws vibrated violently in synchronization with the hive. Mechanical clamps extended and retracted with precision, and syringes twitched toward us, seeking bioelectric resonance. Micro-cliffhanger. A serrated clamp lunged at my arm, stopping millimeters from contact, projecting a vision of my body fused with grafted nodes, sinew, and brass. My own reflexes felt insufficient. Mere observation had already made us participants. Gravity shifted unpredictably, floor sections pulsed like lungs, and walls contracted subtly, guiding our movement into the altar's influence. Micro-cliffhanger. A grafted tendon erupted beneath Calum, wrapping partially around his leg before violently retracting, leaving him disoriented, slick with sweat, and physically contorted. Each reaction, each heartbeat, each micro-movement accelerated the lattice's growth, feeding the Soul Butcher's feast. The warp lattice projected psychic waves that assaulted perception. Micro cliffhanger. Calum experienced a shared hallucination of the feast consuming us. Our bodies fused into grotesque nodes of sinew, brass, and instruments. His scream echoed unnaturally, embedded in our perception, amplifying fear and reinforcing the lattice's resonance. Thoughts fragmented, replaced by rhythmic pulses that matched the altar's beat. Grafted nodes responded dynamically to the psychic assault. Limbs extended impossibly, eyes rotated independently, torsos twisted with premeditated intent, anticipating our reactions. Micro cliffhanger. Jaren staggered as a detached limb passed through him, leaving a psychic imprint that caused tremors in his nervous system, a residual effect that distorted movement and reaction time. The hive was no longer simply observing, it was integrating, reshaping us in real time. Approaching the altar's central node, instruments became aggressively responsive. Bone saws vibrated in alignment with the lattice. Clamps lunged and retracted rhythmically. Syringes probed air for bioelectric contact. Micro cliffhanger. Calum, involuntarily drawn toward a saw by psychic pull, was yanked back just in time. The saw recoiled violently, releasing a shockwave that distorted shadows, rattled floors, and left residual echoes of fear in our nervous systems. We existed in a nexus where environmental, psychic, and ritualized forces converged. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed near-total resonance, integrating instruments, grafted nodes, and the squad's bioelectric presence into a semi-conscious feedback loop. The Soul Butcher's feast was no longer a ritual. It had become an adaptive entity capable of reshaping perception, consuming biological matter and bending reality. Shadows detached entirely, forming humanoid shapes with grotesque distortions, elongated limbs, warped heads, gaping mouths. Micro cliffhanger. One shadow struck Calum psychically, leaving him staggered, vision fracturing into impossible geometries and flickering faces. The chamber's hum reached a frequency that resonated through teeth, sternum and skull embedding the ritual's rhythm into every nerve ending, reducing perception to vibration and fear. Grafted bodies and instruments coordinated with lethal efficiency. Limbs lashed, torsos twisted, eyes rotated independently, and instruments projected psychic pulses that assaulted nervous systems directly. Micro cliffhanger. Calum's body was partially drawn toward a serrated saw by lattice projection. I intervened, pulling him back just in time. The instrument recoiled violently, sending a shockwave through the chamber, distorting shadows, rattling floors, and leaving lingering psychic echoes. We were now nodes within the lattice. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed full resonance and full integration of subnetworks and squad bioelectric presence. The Soul Butcher's feast was poised for maximum manifestation. Survival required calculation, discipline, and precise movement. Hesitation guaranteed assimilation, transformation, or consumption. The altar pulsed with malignant intent, projecting waves of warp energy and rhythm with the lattice and our bioelectric activity. Micro cliffhanger. A grafted torso convulsed violently, expelling warp-tainted fluid into the air, burning eyes and lungs, forcing Calum to stagger backward. Shadows merged with instruments and nodes, forming predatory composites that assaulted senses rather than bodies. Every reaction, heartbeat, and movement fed the lattice, accelerating completion. The final threshold approached. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed full resonance, full integration, and awareness of our presence. The Soul Butcher's feast was prepared to manifest fully. Every micro-action, every spike of emotion, every breath contributed to the hive's growth. The chamber awaited, alive, aware, and insatiably hungry, ready to consume, transform, or fuse us into permanent nodes of its semi-conscious network. The next moments would decide our fate. The altar's pulse had transformed into a living cadence that thrummed through bone, sinew, and armor alike. Every heartbeat, every breath, every tremor was absorbed, measured, and projected back by the warp lattice, amplifying fear into tangible energy. Micro cliffhanger. Calum's body convulsed violently, flesh twisting as sinews lengthened and fused with invisible warp strands. He screamed, but the sound was absorbed, duplicated, and layered into a chorus of other voices, screams, chants, and gnashing teeth that seemed to echo from every direction at once. The grafted bodies reacted violently, detaching limbs and twisting torsos mid-air, eyes rotating independently and forming additional clusters where none should exist. Micro cliffhanger. A torso lunged at Jaren, phasing through him completely, leaving a psychic imprint that forced his muscles into unnatural contortions. Shadows flickered along the walls, detaching to form distorted reflections of the squad, exaggerating every movement in grotesque mimicry. The instruments on the altar had reached full sentience in combination with the lattice. Bone saws vibrated violently, mechanical clamps lunged and retracted with calculated precision, and syringes twitched toward us, sensing bioelectric resonance. Micro cliffhanger. A serrated clamp lunged at my arm, stopping millimeters from contact, projecting an image of my body being fused with grafted nodes, sinew, and brass. Observation itself had made us participants in the feast. Gravity shifted unpredictably. Floors pulsed like lungs. Walls contracted and expanded subtly, channeling our movement directly into the altar's influence. Micro cliffhanger. A grafted tendon erupted beneath Calum, curling around his leg before violently retracting, leaving him disoriented and slick with sweat. Every reaction, heartbeat, and micro-movement fed the lattice, accelerating the Soul Butcher's feast toward full manifestation. The warp lattice now projected psychic waves directly into our minds. Micro cliffhanger. Calum experienced a collective hallucination of the feast consuming the squad, our bodies merging into grotesque nodes of sinew, brass, and instruments. His scream pierced our perception, amplified by the chamber embedding fear directly into our nervous systems. Cognition fragmented, reduced to pulses in rhythm with the altar. Grafted nodes responded dynamically, limbs extended, eyes rotated independently, torsos twisted with premeditated intent, anticipating movement and fear. Micro cliffhanger. Jaren staggered as a detached limb passed through him, leaving a psychic imprint that caused involuntary spasms. The hive was no longer simply observing. We were being reshaped, integrated, consumed in real time. Approaching the altar's central node, the instruments became overtly aggressive. Bone saws vibrated in synchronization with the lattice. Clamps lunged and retracted rhythmically. Syringes probed for bioelectric contact. Micro cliffhanger. Calum was drawn involuntarily toward a saw by psychic pull. I grabbed him just in time, but the saw recoiled violently, releasing a shockwave that distorted shadows, rattled the floor, and left lingering echoes in our nervous systems. We existed in a nexus where environmental, psychic, and ritualized forces converged. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed near-total resonance, integrating instruments, grafted nodes, and squad bioelectric presence into a semi-conscious feedback loop. The Soul Butcher's feast had become an adaptive entity, capable of reshaping reality, consuming biological matter and bending perception. Shadows detached entirely, forming humanoid shapes with grotesque distortions, elongated limbs, warped heads, mouths agape in silent screams. Micro cliffhanger. One shadow struck Calum psychically, leaving him staggered, vision fracturing into impossible geometries and flickering faces. The chamber's hum reached a frequency that resonated through teeth, sternum, and skull, embedding the ritual's rhythm into every nerve ending. Grafted bodies and instruments coordinated with lethal efficiency. Limbs lashed, torsos twisted, eyes rotated independently, and instruments projected psychic pulses that assaulted nervous systems. Micro cliffhanger. Calum's body was partially drawn toward a serrated saw by lattice projection. I intervened, pulling him back. The instrument recoiled violently, sending a shockwave through the chamber, distorting shadows, rattling floors, and leaving residual psychic echoes. We were now nodes within the lattice. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed full resonance, full integration, and full awareness of our presence by the warp lattice. The Soul Butcher's feast was poised to manifest fully. Every heartbeat, every micro-reaction, every breath contributed to its growth. Hesitation guaranteed assimilation. Survival required precise coordination. The altar pulsed with malevolent purpose, projecting waves of warp energy in rhythm with the lattice and our bioelectric activity. Micro cliffhanger. A grafted torso convulsed violently, expelling warp-tainted fluid into the air, burning eyes and lungs, forcing Calum to stagger backward. Shadows merged with instruments and nodes, forming predatory composites that assaulted perception rather than flesh. Every reaction, heartbeat, and micro-movement accelerated completion of the feast. The final threshold was at hand. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed full resonance, integration, and semi-conscious awareness of our squad. The Soul Butcher's feast was ready to consume, transform, or fuse all present into permanent nodes of its semi-conscious network. The chamber awaited, alive, aware, and insatiably hungry. Every micro-action, every emotional spike, every breath contributed to its growth. The next moments would determine survival, assimilation, or permanent fusion into the lattice. The chamber had become fully alive, a predator in its own right. Every pulse of the warp lattice reverberated through bone, sinew, and armor, embedding the ritual's rhythm into our nervous systems. Micro-cliffhanger. Caelim's body convulsed violently as sinews twisted, bones elongating, fusing partially with invisible warp tendrils. His scream was swallowed by the altar's resonance and duplicated into a chorus that layered itself across the chamber, embedding terror in every nerve ending. Grafted bodies reacted instantly, limbs detaching to strike with impossible precision, torsos contorting midair, eyes rotating independently and forming grotesque clusters where none should exist. Micro-cliffhanger. One torso lunged at Jaren, phasing through him completely, leaving a psychic imprint that forced his muscles into unnatural spasms. Shadows detached from the walls entirely, forming distorted reflections of the squad, exaggerating every movement grotesquely. The instruments on the altar had achieved full sentience through the lattice. Bone saws vibrated violently in synchronization with the hive, mechanical clamps lunged and retracted rhythmically, and syringes probed the air for bioelectric contact. Micro-cliffhanger. A serrated clamp lunged toward my arm, stopping millimeters from contact, projecting an image of my body being fused with grafted nodes, sinew, and brass. Observation itself had already made us participants. Gravity fluctuated violently. Floors pulsed like lungs. Walls contracted and expanded subtly, channeling our movement into the altar's influence. Micro-cliffhanger. A grafted tendon erupted beneath Caelim, wrapping partially around his leg before retracting violently, leaving him disoriented and slick with sweat. Each micro-movement, every heartbeat, every subtle reaction fed the lattice, accelerating the Soul Butcher's feast toward its culmination. The warp lattice now assaulted perception directly. Micro-cliffhanger. Caelim experienced a collective hallucination of the feast consuming us, our bodies merging into grotesque nodes of sinew, brass, and mechanical instruments. His scream resonated unnaturally, embedding fear into our nervous systems and reinforcing the lattice's control. Cognition fragmented, reduced to pulses in rhythm with the altar. Grafted nodes adapted dynamically. Limbs extended impossibly, eyes rotated independently, torsos twisted with deliberate intent, anticipating reactions. Micro-cliffhanger. Jaren staggered as a detached limb passed through him, leaving a psychic imprint that caused involuntary spasms. The hive's semi-conscious system was no longer observing. We were being reshaped and integrated in real time. Approaching the altar's core, instruments reacted aggressively. Bone saws vibrated violently. Mechanical clamps lunged and retracted. Syringes extended toward bioelectric signatures. Micro-cliffhanger. Caelim was drawn involuntarily toward a saw by psychic pull, yanked back just in time. The saw recoiled, releasing a shockwave that distorted shadows, rattled floors, and left lingering psychic echoes. We existed in a nexus where environmental, psychic, and ritualized forces converged. Macro-cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed near-total resonance, integrating instruments, grafted nodes, and squad bioelectric presence into a semi-conscious feedback loop. The Soul Butcher's feast was now an adaptive entity, capable of reshaping reality, consuming matter, and bending perception. Shadows detached completely, forming humanoid shapes with grotesque distortions, elongated limbs, warped heads, gaping mouths. Micro-cliffhanger. One shadow struck Caelim psychically, leaving him staggered, vision fragmenting into impossible geometries and flickering faces. The chamber's hum reached a frequency that resonated through teeth, sternum, and skull, embedding the ritual's rhythm into every nerve ending. Grafted bodies and instruments coordinated with lethal efficiency. Limbs lashed, torsos twisted, eyes rotated independently, and instruments projected psychic pulses directly into nervous systems. Micro-cliffhanger. Caelim's body was partially drawn toward a serrated saw by lattice projection. I intervened, pulling him back. The instrument recoiled violently, sending a shockwave through the chamber, distorting shadows, rattling floors, and leaving residual psychic echoes. We had become nodes within the lattice. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed full resonance, full integration, and full awareness of our presence by the warp lattice. The Soul Butcher's feast was poised to fully manifest. Every heartbeat, micro-movement, and breath contributed to its growth. Hesitation meant assimilation. Survival required precise coordination and immediate, decisive action. The altar pulsed with malevolent intent, projecting waves of warp energy in rhythm with the lattice and our bioelectric activity. Micro cliffhanger. A grafted torso convulsed violently, expelling warp-tainted fluid into the air, burning eyes and lungs, forcing Calum to stagger backward. Shadows merged with instruments and nodes, forming predatory composites that assaulted perception rather than flesh. Every micro-reaction, heartbeat, and motion accelerated the feast's completion. The final threshold approached. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed full resonance, full integration, and semi-conscious awareness of the squad. The Soul Butcher's feast was ready to consume, transform, or fuse all present into permanent nodes of its semi-conscious network. The chamber awaited, alive, aware, and insatiably hungry. The next moments would determine whether we survived, were assimilated, or became permanent nodes of the lattice. The altar's pulse had reached absolute dominance. Every breath, every heartbeat, every subtle motion of our bodies was absorbed and amplified, shaping the chamber's reality. Micro cliffhanger. Calum convulsed violently, sinews and flesh fusing with warp energy, bones elongating, joints twisting into geometries that violated natural law. His scream was amplified and layered, echoing across the chamber, embedding terror into the walls, the floor. The very air, grafted bodies convulsed with precision, limbs detaching to strike independently, torsos twisting mid-air, eyes rotating in clusters where none should exist. Micro cliffhanger. A torso lunged at Jaren, phasing through him completely, leaving a psychic imprint that forced his muscles into contorted spasms. Shadows detached entirely from the walls, forming distorted duplicates of the squad, exaggerating every motion grotesquely. The altar's instruments had reached full sentience. Bone saws vibrated violently, mechanical clamps lunged and retracted, syringes twitched toward bioelectric signatures. Micro cliffhanger. A serrated clamp lunged at my arm, stopping millimeters from contact, projecting an image of my body merging with grafted nodes in brass. Observation alone had made us integral to the feast. Gravity fluctuated unpredictably. Floors pulsed like lungs. Walls contracted subtly, channeling our movement toward the altar. Micro cliffhanger. A grafted tendon erupted beneath Calum, wrapping partially around his leg before retracting violently, leaving him disoriented and sweating. Every micro-reaction, heartbeat, and motion accelerated the Soul Butcher's feast, feeding the lattice with life force, fear, and cognition. The warp lattice projected psychic waves directly into our minds. Micro cliffhanger. Calum experienced a shared hallucination of the feast consuming the squad. Our bodies fused into grotesque nodes of sinew, brass, and instruments. His scream penetrated perception unnaturally, embedding fear directly into our nervous systems and reinforcing the lattice's resonance. Cognition fragmented, reduced to rhythmic pulses in harmony with the altar. Grafted nodes adapted dynamically, limbs extended impossibly, torsos twisted with deliberate intent, eyes rotated independently, anticipating every movement and reaction. Micro cliffhanger. Jaren staggered as a detached limb passed through him, leaving a psychic imprint that forced spasms and contortions. The hive was no longer merely observing. We were being reshaped, partially absorbed in real time. Approaching the altar's core, instruments reacted aggressively. Bone saws vibrated violently, clamps lunged and retracted, syringes extended toward bioelectric signals. Micro cliffhanger. Calum was drawn involuntarily toward a saw by psychic pull. I yanked him back just as the saw recoiled violently, sending shockwaves that distorted shadows, rattled floors, and left residual psychic echoes. We existed in a nexus of environmental, psychic, and ritualized assault. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed total resonance, integrating instruments, grafted nodes, and the squad's presence into a semi-conscious feedback loop. The Soul Butcher's feast had become an adaptive entity, capable of consuming matter, reshaping perception, and bending reality itself. Shadows detached completely, forming humanoid shapes with grotesque distortions, elongated limbs, warped heads, gaping mouths. Micro cliffhanger. One shadow struck Calum psychically, leaving him staggered, vision fracturing into impossible geometries and flickering faces. The chamber's hum resonated through teeth, sternum, and skull, embedding the ritual's rhythm into every nerve ending. Grafted bodies and instruments coordinated with lethal efficiency. Limbs lashed, torsos twisted, eyes rotated independently. Instruments projected psychic pulses. Micro cliffhanger. Calum's body was partially drawn toward a serrated saw by lattice projection. I intervened, pulling him back. The saw recoiled violently, releasing a shockwave that distorted shadows, rattled floors, and left lingering echoes in the air. We had become nodes within the lattice. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed full integration and awareness of our presence. The Soul Butcher's feast was prepared to manifest fully. Every heartbeat, every micro-reaction, every thought contributed to its growth. Hesitation meant assimilation. Survival required immediate and precise action. The altar pulsed with malevolent intelligence, projecting waves of warp energy in rhythm with the lattice and our bioelectric activity. Micro cliffhanger. A grafted torso convulsed violently, ejecting warp-tainted fluid into the air, burning eyes and lungs, forcing Calum to stagger backward. Shadows merged with instruments and nodes, forming predatory composites that assaulted perception rather than flesh. Every reaction, heartbeat, and micro-movement accelerated the feast's completion. The final threshold arrived. Macro cliffhanger. Telemetry confirmed total resonance and awareness of the squad. The Soul Butcher's feast reached full manifestation. In moments, our bodies, consciousnesses, and bioelectric signatures would either be assimilated, transformed, or fused permanently into the lattice. I realized clinically that we were already partially consumed, memories, thoughts, and fear embedded into the hive. Micro cliffhanger. Calum's scream ceased abruptly, replaced by a silent convulsion as his body partially fused with grafted nodes, sinew interlacing with brass. Jaren staggered beside him, trembling, his perception fractured into overlapping realities. The altar pulsed one final time, a crescendo of malevolent energy. Macro cliffhanger. The Soul Butcher's feast had consumed the majority of our bioelectric signatures, fusing portions of flesh, mind, and armor into permanent nodes. Only fragments of consciousness remained. The chamber itself seemed satisfied, yet the hum persisted, a reminder that the feast was not complete, not contained, and that its hunger extended beyond this room, beyond Korvax 9, potentially into the stars. As I staggered back, partially transformed, partially intact, the final image lingered in my mind. Calum and Jaren, frozen mid-transformation, their forms grotesque amalgamations of flesh, sinew, and brass, eyes wide in frozen horror. The altar pulsed with subtle, lingering intent, as if acknowledging completion and yet promising more. The Soul Butcher's feast was now a living, semi-conscious entity, existing in part within us in the chamber, and extending beyond the material boundaries of the hive. I marked telemetry, recorded coordinates, and initiated emergency containment protocols. Macro cliffhanger. Though partially surviving, partially aware, we were irrevocably changed. The feast remained active, its consciousness partially integrated with ours, a persistent threat. The chamber, now silent save for residual hum, waited, alive, aware, and insatiably hungry. The final image burned in my mind. The feast, infinite, patient, and waiting, ready to expand.